All right, welcome back to the program. Just like I said earlier, Dr. Matthias Schmale is my guest. He's the United Nations resident and humanitarian coordinator in Nigeria. He has a PhD in economics, but he rarely uses the doctor. And anytime I speak with him or interview him on a panel, I always put the doctor because he's a Nigerian now. At least he's a Nigerian, and Nigerians like titles. So, so welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Now, where should we start from? I know you have visited many states. Your work is a humanitarian work. You get to interact with a lot of people across the country. Let's start with the flooding situation. How serious is this flooding situation? How much of a crisis are we in?
So I've visited over the last 10 days, first Anambra, then Adamawa, and then Bayelsa in the south. Okay. So really across the country. And I have been surprised at how serious it is. Some of the images I saw of houses still being at least half underwater, forcing people to sleep on higher ground or in boats. One of the things people talk to me about is being worried that their children at night would fall into the water. In Bayelsa, they told me of several children dying that way. So there were these very personal stories of people worried on how to survive just the floods themselves. And I must say then, looking at it more from a distance, traveling across the rivers in Bayelsa, for example, the extent reminded me of the images we saw of Pakistan a few weeks or months ago. It really, as I've said, in all three places, and as I've heard from other states, it's in 34 states, this is a crisis of major proportion.
Which states do you think is most affected by the assessment of United Nations here in Nigeria? Because our own Minister of Humanitarian Affairs did say some time ago that Jigawa State is the most affected.
Yeah. Listen, we don't look at this as UN through the lens of which state is most affected. We are looking at it from the point of view of which people are most affected. And it is obviously people across all 34 states affected living close to rivers. I think it's fair to say, and it's not a state problem, it's a problem, a challenge, a crisis for people living close to rivers across the country. And all the states that have major rivers flowing through it have been affected. And I think we should avoid making this an issue of which state is worst affected. It's people. There are 1.4 million people at least that are displaced across all states. More than 600 people have lost their lives. So that's our lens and our focus. And again, it's not entire states, or rarely. Bayelsa is more or less affected as a state and is still cut off, or at least when I was there a few days ago. So of course there is a state lens to this, but again, I would insist, let's look at this through the eyes of the vulnerable people that have lost their farmland and their
And do you think that 1.4 million people that have been displaced so far, do you think that they will get their lives back prior or pre the flooding? What should be the priority to help people get back now? In what terms? Are we taking a look at perhaps cash? Are we taking a look at clean water, for example? What exactly?
Yeah. That's a really interesting question, because I said to colleagues, by the time we got there, we were all a bit late, if all truth be told, with some exceptions. But by the time we got there, it wasn't time to bring the ambulance. The accident had happened, people were in hospital, as it were, and we needed to help them survive. But as I was traveling through these three states and hearing from others, the issue now is early recovery, exactly as you imply with your question. So where it's possible, and it is starting to be possible, the waters are receding and the homes still exist. It's about bringing people back. It's ensuring early recovery, that they have something to eat, that they have water to drink, and then that a way is found of recovering their assets. In my mind is a figure of 600,000 hectares of farmland at minimum being destroyed. That's so huge I can't even picture it properly, but a lot of people have lost their farmland, their agricultural means. And yes, I think in this early recovery phase, cash-based assistance is the best way to go, on top of material assistance like food and water. But increasingly this is about early recovery, and cash-based is the right way to go, because it gives people choices. Each family has different priorities. For some it will be to bring their children back to school. For others, it will be to buy seeds and fertilizer. So the more we can give them the choice to invest into what matters to them, the better.
So where do you think that cash will really come from in terms of the financing? Is the United Nations looking at that? Is your office looking at that? And how much are we looking at? For example, because for someone, I've seen those gory images on television. In fact, this is the worst flood that we've experienced in the last 10 years. The last one that happened 10 years ago, I was I was in it, as it were, in Lokoja. I experienced it firsthand. So I understand what people are going through right now. So if we're talking about this cash-based support, like how much are we looking at? Because many households, for example, have small businesses, have medium businesses that the flood has, taken all this away from them. Is it an average?
I'll come back to the dimension and numbers and amounts around this. Allow me just to say that what is now has to happen is a proper damage assessment, and the World Bank actually has a world accepted and known tool to do a broad assessment of the actual damage, and they will help us come to proper amounts in terms of what needs to be invested. Now, I know from NEMA, the National Emergency Management Agency, that they are talking about an overall amount of $70 million that is needed at this point for both still meeting the humanitarian needs, but then into early recovery. I suspect that's a conservative number, that this will rise as the World Bank will help do the proper assessment. Now again, we then need to break that down. These are aggregate figures. In terms of what's available, I can tell you that the United Nations has mobilized about $10 million.
Okay.
So that's, a seventh of the amount NEMA seems to be talking about. And again, a combination of immediate assistance, food, water, but also slowly moving into cash-based early recovery assistance. I know that the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Federation has asked for 13 million Swiss francs. I don't know how much of that they've got in yet. I know that some member states have offered support, like the United States immediately put $1 million on the table. But you can hear from these numbers, maybe there's 20 million there from the international community. If it goes well, 70 million at least are needed. So that means the bulk has to come from within Nigeria. I think it is unlikely that we will be able, given everything else that's going on, Ukraine war, etc., to mobilize 70 million. And since you've mentioned one more point here, the floods 10 years ago, I believe that was in the time of President Jonathan. And I have heard that at that time, $60 million were mobilized locally, with many businesses and private individuals investing. So, maybe the economy has gotten worse since then, but it's possible. I think we should not just look at the international community. The international community will be complementary to the efforts that need to happen locally.
So what kind of efforts are you expecting to happen locally? What kind of mobilization to assist these vulnerable people at this time and the households that risk of not just that the flood has destroyed their lives and their livelihoods, but have also, even psychologically, coming back from that kind of distress is so, is so huge at this point. So what kind of assistance?
So, I think it needs to be a combination of assistance. So there is some at state level. I saw in all 3 states I visited, but I know this happens in other states too. So I'm just using that as an illustration. Governors really mobilizing, including using resources available to them at state level from their state budgets. That's one avenue that will continue. And really, I salute some of the governors who are out there visiting the flood-affected communities with their teams. In Bayelsa, the governor brought his whole team to visit, and when I saw them, they were in the 3rd week of visiting each and every flood-affected community. Governor Soludo in Anambra, something similar. So the state-level effort will be crucial to this. I think it must be complemented by a federal effort, and again, I hope that NEMA will soon issue its appeal and that some federal resources will flow into that. And then I've mentioned the international community aspect. What I cannot see so far is a credible, trusted mechanism for the private sector and individuals. To the best of my knowledge, that doesn't exist. And so one of the things I'm trying to push as UN resident and humanitarian coordinator is, can we learn from this? And can we as quickly as possible help set up a mechanism that does exist in other countries for people, that people trust, in terms of, if I give money into this, it will reach the affected people. That, to the best of my knowledge, at national level doesn't exist.
Okay, so what kind of engagement have you been having with the leadership so far, perhaps from the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs, Disaster Management and Social Development, the minister there, and some other relevant federal government agencies or even states? If you've had engagements with them, how have that engagement been?
So there's three I would like to talk about. One is my colleagues in OCHA, the Office for Coordination Humanitarian Assistance. We have a head of OCHA, his name is Trond, and he accompanied me on some of these visits. He has been working closely with the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs, senior officials there, to help pull together this NEMA plan, because NEMA, of course, reports into the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs. Secondly, at my level, the one key senior engagement I've had is with the Minister of Water Resources.
Okay.
Because as you will know, the President, I think, in recognizing the effort has been too slow, too little, has tasked the Minister of Water Resources with coming up with a medium-term plan to be better prepared for the future and to respond. So I have offered the support of the United Nations to the Minister of Water Resources to really learn from this and be better prepared for this. Because while we're preoccupied with the current crisis, we know, given climate change, this will happen again. And we need to be better prepared. And then thirdly, it's really at the state level. If we want to make a difference, action is happening at the state level. And so I've prioritized at senior level my engagement with governors.
Okay. While you were speaking earlier, I caught when you said that you were not adequately prepared. That's perhaps from you and government authorities. Why were the authorities not really adequately prepared, even though the warning was there? For example, flooding the Lagdo Dam in Cameroon and all of that. We've seen that, it's like a cycle. So why do you think that inadequate preparedness was there, despite the warnings?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know if I have a convincing answer for that, including for the United Nations, because, I cannot just point fingers at others. I think you are right, the warnings were there. But the science of prediction is not entirely accurate. So I heard one governor who said to me, we've been warned every year since 10 years ago.
Yes.
Watch it, this year will be worse than the last one. And there's a crying wolf syndrome here. If you get told this year after year and then it doesn't happen, of course you get preoccupied by other things. So I think it's not ill intent, either by those who were warning from the federal level or by governors and others not really acting on those warnings, because it has been 10 years since we've seen this. So that's one element. I think a second element is there are so many competing priorities on all of our agendas as United Nations, but also government. We have a major nutrition crisis going on in the country. We have the conflict in the Northeast. We have 100 million people, according to the World Bank, living below $1 a day. I don't know how they survive. So it's hard to prioritize, or maybe I should say it differently, you will prioritize the needs of the day, I think, inevitably, if you are in government responsibility or if you are the UN trying to support this. So it's a combination of, is it really going to happen, and then getting diverted into all sorts of other crisis management.
Yeah, because I spoke to I had an interview about 3 weeks ago or so with the Director General of the Hydrological Services, and he did tell me here that, Nancy, we warned even the states, with letters and all of that, but they seemed not to have taken that warning. So that warning was there.
Yeah.
How serious do you think that this climate crisis would affect Nigeria?
Well, I think if we needed a wake-up call, we got it. So despite trying to justify or explain why there was not enough preparedness, we cannot ignore this. And one minimum thing that needs to come out of this, apart from helping the 1.4 million people get back to their homes and lives, is to be better prepared for the next time. I think so. There is an element of, led by the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs, improving preparedness for response for a number of different crises, not just floods, but nutrition and so on. And then I think the medium to long term is about the Nigerian government being supported in realizing some of its plans that are directly linked to the climate crisis. So to give an example, a few weeks ago or a month ago by now, the energy transition plan was published. And it's very clear that many people, especially in rural areas, not having enough access to sustainable energy is contributing to this. They're going out, deforesting, collecting firewood. And so there is the immediate, there's the early recovery, and there's the investment into better preparedness for response and mitigating and adapting to the climate change. So it's complex.
And this climate change, let's talk a little bit about it before I go into the food insecurity issues. COP27 is on right now, and it's been said that we should not just only take a look at climate adaptation, but also mitigation. What do you think? That's the first part of the question. The other part of the question is about the loss and the damage reparations. COP27 is ongoing right now. In Egypt, we've seen different countries come out to even commit. I think last week the Prime Minister of Britain, Rishi Sunak, announced some financing to assist developing countries, and I think Nigeria will get also a huge chunk from that. I think about 500 million pounds, if I'm not mistaken. So what do you think about all of this?
So I think there are indeed these two tracks. There is urgent investment needed into mitigation and adaptation measures, and to break that down for Nigeria, I think I've mentioned the energy transition plan. If especially rural communities don't have access to sustainable energy, they will go out, collect firewood and contribute to deforestation. If businesses don't get more sustainable access to energy, they will continue depending on oil and gas and contribute to emissions. So there is a need for this, and I think investing into the energy transition plan now, I don't know if you know, the government is saying they need $10 billion a year until 2063. That's a very tall order, and I think we need to be realistic that the bulk of that is not going to come from overseas. We saw it brings us to the sensitive question of how does government prioritize its own spending at federal and state government levels. So that's one element. There are some very practical measures that need to be invested into. So you mentioned the dam in Cameroon. All of the governors talked to me about better management of rivers by constructing on the Nigerian side dams that can manage better the flow of waters. And you cannot expect the international community to do that. So that's a serious measure that needs to happen here. There are also other very practical measures like investing into bamboo planting and mangroves, because that helps prevent serious erosion. It helps make the river banks stronger, and roads. I don't remember in which state it was. I could see that roads which had bamboo next to it, those parts of the road were still intact, whereas roads that had no protective vegetation were swept away. And that's why both in Anambra and in Bayelsa, I saw communities still cut off because roads had simply been washed away. So there's simple stuff that can be done. I mentioned earlier people living close to rivers, and there is stuff that can be done at relatively low cost to reinforce. So that's one element. You also asked me about damage and loss. My leadership has been very clear that there is, so the Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General, that there's a compelling case that those that cause climate change by being the major emitters, and they mostly sit in the West and partly in the East, have to come up with some of the money to compensate the countries, and Nigeria is one of them, that are not causing this in the first instance, but that are suffering from the consequences. So there is a moral argument to be made. Again, I'm not sure how much we can realistically expect out of this.
Out of the COP27?
Out of COP27, what I'm hearing back is that the financing is apparently the major topic in the plenary, in many of the workshops. But what my UN colleagues are also feeding back is so far the commitments are far below expectations and what's needed.
Just like Antonio Guterres said last week that we're on the highway to climate hell.
Yes, he's right.
He's right.
I think he's right, and you know, sadly, it is sort of linked to your earlier question of why weren't we prepared. You know, you see it in Nigeria, we weren't enough prepared, but it's a global issue, and that's what Guterres is saying. You know, we have to wake up, because we will see more of the Pakistans, we will see more of what we're seeing in Nigeria in terms of the flooding, the nutrition crisis, and so on. And if we don't wake up soon, the planet will get warmer than 1.5 degrees, and that is indeed a road to hell, as he put it.
How do you think that pockets of this that we have seen in Nigeria, in Pakistan, in Chad, in Somalia, for example, children are dying, there's a huge hunger crisis, drought.
Correct.
Children are dying on the backs of their moms. Very gory pictures to see. How do you think that these events that we're seeing around the world would impact the SDG goals by 2030? The actualization of the SDG goals, some of those goals, to poverty, hunger, you know, and all of that. In fact, if not even all of them, because they are somehow intertwined.
That's really interesting, your question. Again, I was recently in New York for a global meeting of all resident coordinators like myself. There's 130 of us around the globe. And it was interesting, the key message of the Secretary General and his deputy, Amina Mohammed, was the name of the game, if that's a correct or appropriate expression, now is to save the SDGs. You know, they were both very clear that the war in Ukraine, the COVID crisis, the major famine in East Africa, Pakistan, Nigeria now, and other places, so the impact of climate change has thrown us back in terms of achieving the SDGs. It's very clear in the case of Nigeria that Nigeria lags far behind in meeting the SDGs, far behind. And so this needs to be turned around, and the instruction and marching order I got from the Secretary General with my colleagues was your agenda is to help countries rescue the SDGs. It's about development. Yes, there's these other crises. And you know, what was interesting and maybe of interest to you, he gave us 3 priorities to look at. Number 1, invest into education. Because he said at the end of the day, you will not rescue development if children aren't properly educated. And there's a link with climate change. His second priority was climate change. We have to get serious about this. And the linkage between the two is, I think, our biggest hope for seriously mitigating against the impact of climate change is getting the young to understand what's going on and to be conscious and act accordingly. So education needs to, in schools, have a clear climate change element in the curriculum. That's the link between the two. But again, he said if we want to rescue the development agenda, invest into education as the top priority, invest into climate change, as we've talked about, adaptation and mitigation. And then the third bit is governance and human rights and peace. You know, so I think as with my, not with my humanitarian coordinator hat on, but with my resident coordinator hat on, this is over the next 5 years what we will try to work with the Nigerian government on. It is to rescue the SDGs.
Now let's move over to the food insecurity. How food insecure is Nigeria? Because sometimes, you know, you get to hear from government authorities, okay, I've even heard from a few government authorities because this flooding would impact food production in Nigeria because majority of farmlands are submerged and flood. That's also money that has been eroded, investments that have been eroded, and it's been said, okay, that some foods will be released from the strategic food reserve and all of that. But with your own eagle's eye, assess for me how food insecure we are. That's one. Then nutritional, because it's not just about also eating food. A lot of Nigerians cannot afford 3 square meals now. You said it earlier, you know, just around close to 100 million people live on less than $1 US a day. The nutritional crisis too, because for Nigerians, many Nigerians now, what they're really interested in is if I can get food into my stomach, it doesn't matter. I'm not talking of a balanced diet.
Yes.
Right now, it's just food to keep, you know, my systems running and a little bit of sugar in my body. So it's not about the balanced diet, protein, carbohydrates, and all of that, vitamins and what you have. So What are your views on this?
So let me first of all say something about dimensions. We work every year with government on something that's called cadre harmonisé. It's a tool to assess the humanitarian needs in the country. And the cadre harmonisé for this year, for 2022, predicted at the beginning of the year that 19 million people in Nigeria, that's a lot of people, 19 million people are food insecure.
19 million people are food insecure in Nigeria.
As we speak. You know, and all the information we're getting back is that this prediction is correct. And by the way, importantly, it's not just the Northeast. You know, sometimes we get accused in the UN, I think unfairly so, for only focusing on the Northeast. And of course, there is a specific dimension there linked to Boko Haram and the insurgency. But the fact of the matter is that across the country, 19 million people are food insecure. And that includes, for example, 3 million people in Lagos itself.
So there are food insecure people in Lagos.
And I was staggered.
Yeah.
I found it staggering when people told me in Lagos they think it's 3 million people. Now, if you have more than 20 million people in a mega city like this, maybe it's not so surprising. And you know, I've been to Lagos a couple of times. As you drive in, there are clearly huge slum areas where people are struggling. So it's unsurprising. We don't maybe hear so much about it because Lagos has found ways of coping with it, I think, and we can get back to that, including having a local food bank, as they call it, established by, if I understood correctly, the state government with private businesses. But so that's the dimension. Again, it's a major crisis across the country. Why is it happening? There are different factors. We've spoken about climate change. I've made a reference to the insurgency in the Northeast and violence in other parts. By the way, part of the climate change, I think, as you know better than I, is farmer-herder conflicts, which I think have to do with the Sahara traveling south and herders being pushed further southwards in search for suitable land for their animals to graze. So it's not necessarily or at all a politically driven agenda. I think people are forced to survive, to travel south, and that's where that's part of the explanation for this conflict. Now, a third factor I want to mention after climate change and the stuff I just talked about in terms of conflict and insurgency is management of food in the country. I think there is a big agenda here to revitalize and strengthen food systems. And let me give you a concrete example. A captain of industry, a Nigerian, told me a few months ago that Nigeria is the 12th biggest producer of tomatoes in the world. But only 20% or so of the tomatoes produced reach the market. And so what he was explaining to me is there's an issue of infrastructure, there's an issue of farmers not being connected to markets in towns like market, and there is an issue of how the economy is structured and whether the incentives are right to produce for what the market needs. And so I think what I'm trying to say is we can't just push it down to global trends and things like conflict. There is also a governance responsibility for Nigeria to improve the way it manages its food systems. Final point, if I may, is because you mentioned it in terms of nutritious food. When I went to Katsina a few weeks ago, precisely to look at the food insecurity there, and it was stunning. I saw 2 food security, nutrition security centers, one run by MSF and another one by an organization called Alima. And I must say, I last saw malnourished children like that in Ethiopia in 1985. There are pockets in the country where children are seriously at risk of starvation. And it was interesting, some of the people running these centers said a part of the problem is parents not knowing what nutritious food is. That surprised me.
Is it not knowing or not having the money?
Combination. I think it's mostly, we had a heated debate because they weren't united on this point. Some said it's purely affordability, whereas others said we need to be real. It's also about knowledge. And if I look at my own situation in Germany, I come from Germany, it's only over time that we've learned what nutritious food is. There's a reason why we have obesity as a major problem in Western countries. You know, so people can afford good food in most countries there, but they buy the wrong food. So I can relate to people who are saying it's not necessarily an issue of poverty to know what is proper nutritious food. And so our colleagues from UNICEF and the WHO are saying an element of this needs to be to help people understand who can afford it, what nutritious food is about.
Now the question also, which I've tried to analyze even from my own perspective, sometimes when I speak with people or when I'm just ruminating with myself, is nutritious food really expensive or costly? Do you know, food that is nutritious or has nutritional value, is it expensive? Because like I asked earlier, is it about money or is it, you said, knowledge? So we're talking about nutritional valued food, like it will contain your vitamins, your carbohydrates, your proteins, and you know, the classes of foods, I think 7, if my science still serves me right. You know, so is nutritional food expensive?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Again, I'm not sure I have enough expertise to convincingly comment on that. What I've been told by experts is if in the phase, at least in Western countries, where nutritional value became more of an issue because of factors like obesity, initially then the investments into growing more nutritious food, so organic farms, etc., the initial investments made that more expensive than conventional food. That's one element. What I've also been told is a phenomenon in big cities across the world is because of economic pressures, fast food companies sell food cheaper because of mass production. So there is that element also forcing, and it's again, it goes through the pocket there. And people say if you produce junk food on scale, it's cheaper to do than producing healthy food. So I think there is an element of that. But then what people also tell me is, and that's why we need to look at food systems as a whole, if you do the right investments in terms of infrastructure, in terms of market information systems, if producers know that certain food is more in demand because of its nutritional value, they will adjust. You know, so we need to trust markets to regulate this, but that requires, in my understanding, a proper regulatory framework for farmers and producers, and it requires some investment. So it's in this phase, it's probably correct to say in Nigeria, more nutritious food is probably more expensive, but it doesn't have to stay that way. It can be changed.
Do you see a response from authorities to solve this problem of nutrition in Nigeria and this problem of food insecurity? That's one. The B part of my question is, earlier you also mentioned that 19 million people in Nigeria are food insecure. What do we really mean by food insecurity for our viewers? Because from my own perspective, I'm thinking about food security to be about affordability, availability, and what's nutritional. You know, so what's that? Then the C part of the question is that you said 3 million people are food insecure in Lagos alone. And Lagos is the commercial nerve center of the country. If you take a look at that 3 million people data information which you've given me, it's like population of some countries, like even Namibia. For example, I'm not sure Namibia is up to 3 million and some other countries across Africa. So, and you talked about even in Lagos, there's a coping mechanism, or there's a mechanism whereby the Lagos state government is doing with some private food banks. Is that an avenue? Is that a way to go? Or what can also be more sustainable? The fourth part of my question, I hope that I'm not bombarding you.
No,
I'm just trying to remember all that from you, trying to follow up with what you've said, is for people that are suffering from, you know, food deficiencies or nutritional deficiencies and all of that, are there temporal coping mechanisms for people like that? I saw that women or children that are really starved, are there coping mechanisms that their parents can, you know, have to temporal at least to get those children or even the adults, because I'm not adults too may also be, nutritional deficient, or even a lactating mom, or even a pregnant woman, for example. Yes, I hope but you can get started.
I hope I have noted the questions correctly. Let me start with the last one because it's an important one. Yes, I think children, especially children, but you're right, it's also mothers in particular that are at risk at times. Death can be prevented. What our colleagues in UNICEF and WHO, so our health experts, children experts, have worked on around the globe is mechanisms and food that help save lives. So I don't know if you've heard of plumpy nut.
Yes.
It's something that UNICEF imports for the moment to give to children who are at serious risk of dying because of being severely malnourished. And I have seen personally in Katsina, but also in the Bay States, so both in Yobe and Bono, centers, nutrition stabilization centers, where if children were brought in good time, their lives were saved. And after a few days, they are being released in not perfect health, but enough to survive. So there is a disaster response mechanism. And it was interesting, I've heard, I think it's near Kano or in Kano, that there is now a factory that can produce plumpy nut locally. So that would be another combination between increasing response capacity and improving local production. We don't have to import this stuff if we can scale it up inside Nigeria. So that's an answer, I hope, to that question. Now, to come back to your first one, is the government taking it serious and what is it doing about it? You might know that I think it was in 2021 there was a global food summit in Rome. And commitment, just like the COP27 mechanism around climate change, global commitments were made and national commitments were made. And I think the Nigerian government that went there, Minister of Agriculture and some others, made serious commitments to look into transforming food systems in Nigeria. So I believe the commitment is there. They've got some policies, not just climate change related, but farmer-herder related, strengthening the market economy. Having said that, I made a reference earlier, I think there is also an issue of putting your money where your mouth is, if I may put it in those terms. And I know you've discussed with others on this show before the issue of fuel subsidies, for example. So I think it's fair to claim that at the moment, government resources are not going into this priority of revitalizing food systems as much as it should. There is some stuff going on, including investment into infrastructure and roads. I think it's not just a totally negative picture, but much more needs to be done. So that's the government perspective. I think there is a good beginning. It needs to be reinforced, and we need to help them do the needful. Now, in terms of your second question was, what does 19 million people food insecure mean? We have different categories in there, and I don't remember the exact numbers. I do remember that across the north, 600,000 children under the age of 5 are at risk of serious malnutrition. If they don't get reached with, as I described in the first part of my answer, by the experts that save their lives, and other measures. So that's the risk factor there. So when I say 19 million people are food insecure, it doesn't mean 19 million people starving. It means they are at risk of starvation.
That's why I asked that question.
If the right measures are not taken. And again, within that, there are categories that are at serious risk, and we are looking in particular at children and in particular across the north. Now that brings me then to the element of Lagos. And why are we so far not seeing, or why is it not reported that there's massive hunger there? And I think it is around, people clearly don't have enough or the right things to do. That's what gets them into the category of food insecurity. But they then have coping mechanisms. There is, as I mentioned, efforts by the government and the private sector through this food bank as an example. There's NGOs working on this. So there's a lot of effort to help these 3 million people. I think something we haven't talked about is many people in Nigeria, you will know this better than I, are in the informal sector. I think certainly within the UN, we don't at all understand how the informal sector works. But we can see in a place like Lagos that the 3 million people are not into abject hunger, because they must find ways, you know, and the small-scale businesses one sees everywhere. Whenever I travel, I'm amazed at how many small businesses one sees, one after the other. And I wonder, how do they all make money? But clearly they make, in many places, enough to feed their family through. But then final point to say is what my colleagues, the experts, also warn of is the long-term implications. You know, I've mentioned obesity in the West as well, in more developed countries, but stunting is an issue. So even if a child doesn't die, there may be longer term effects of stunting, for example, affecting their learning ability, etc. So we should not make the naive assumption that 19 million people not dying means they're okay. We need to consider that there will be medium to long term effects of this.
Okay, since you assumed your position as the UN resident and humanitarian coordinator, can you give me an idea of like how much humanitarian assistance, at least since you assumed office, what has it been like in terms of cost that you've committed, if you have a figure?
Of course. One thing I can tell you with certainty is, you know, I mentioned earlier we sometimes get critiqued, understandably, though not fully justified, that we focus on the Northeast. So because the government invited us in 2015 to mobilize international assistance for the insurgency crisis in the Northeast, we have been launching annual appeals since then. We have got a coordination mechanism, my OCHA colleagues and others in place. We appealed this year for $1.1 billion to help in the Northeast. We've got about 500 million.
That's a long
that's a, you know, it's 50%. But given the Ukraine crisis, given we are still struggling with COVID, given other hotspots like the east of Africa, the Horn of Africa that you've mentioned, it's not inconsiderable money, I think. It's a considerable amount. Not enough, but 500 million does help us prevent 5 million people or so from further sinking into poverty. Starvation, etc. Now, for the rest of the country, it's a big sort of a mixed picture. We haven't really been asked by the government, and as UN we work on request of governments, certainly democratic governments like here. So we haven't really been asked to assist around the flood crisis now.
Really?
And that's something that I didn't mention earlier. What is required, I think, also for a quicker response is that a government declares an emergency. And neither around the nutrition crisis nor the flood crisis has the federal government declared an actual emergency. They've undertaken emergency measures, and I give them credit for that. They've spoken about it, including the Minister of Humanitarian Affairs. But if you want to mobilize resources, experience from around the globe shows that a government coming out early and saying, you know, we have a cholera crisis or a nutrition crisis or a flooding crisis.
Right now.
That then triggers mobilization efforts. So for the rest of the country, to come back to your question, it's nowhere near this kind of amount. It's
so the $500 million that you've gotten, where did you get it from?
That's the international community. Voluntary contributions. A key country is the United States. But also other mostly Western partners. You know, Germany is a big player. The EU, basically the EU countries, the UK. So it's the global West that is footing most of the bill there.
Okay, just as we go, we've done over 40 minutes.
Wow.
We've been speaking for over 40 minutes, but just as we go, do you have any other thing you've not told me or that I haven't asked? That I haven't asked?
Well, I'm not sure, but I think I would like to come back to the theme of rescuing the SDGs and the development agenda.
So we'll look at that.
I really think, you know, crisis management is one thing, and as I hope I've gotten across in our discussion, there are measures that need to be taken, including declaring a crisis state of emergency. But if we don't look at medium to long-term measures, and that is, to repeat, I think our Secretary General is right when he says we need to invest into education. Something I haven't told you, but I'm sure you are aware of. Our UNICEF colleagues say that there is 20 million children out of school in Nigeria. You know, that in itself is a major crisis. So I think when our Secretary General says, yes, prevent 600,000 severely malnourished children from dying is a day-to-day priority, but you will not solve longer-term prospects for children if you don't support government in getting 20 million children back into school. Similarly, on the floods, yes, we need to help people regain their assets, get back to their homes. But we know floods will happen again because of climate change. So if we don't invest into adaptation and mitigation and lessening the damage into the future, we will continuously be crisis managers with things getting worse instead of addressing the underlying causes.
Okay, I think we'll anchor at this point. But just before, how many years have you been in Nigeria? I don't have.
I came in December last year, so about a year now.
About a year now. What's your favorite food? Because I see anytime I see you going out, you always dress like this. What's your favorite food?
I hope I will not offend anyone, but jollof rice.
Jollof rice.
I love a lot.
Were you born in Botswana?
I was born in Botswana as a missionary kid, yes.
Because I saw that, I was going to ask you. Yeah. So at least that Africanness has been in you, at least from birth.
There is an element. My wife is Kenyan,
so so you're an African.
I've maintained some connection.
You are our in-law. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming on the show. And I hope to have you sometime soon so that we could talk about rescuing SDGs like we mentioned earlier. All right, that's the much we can take. It's been an intensive 45 minutes or so of discussion with the UN resident, United Nations resident and humanitarian coordinator for Nigeria, Dr. Matthias Schmale. That's the much we can take on today's edition of the program. Be the best you can be the change that you want to see, and join me again next time. I am Nancy Naji. Bye now.